to another episode of The Watchdog with me, Lowkey, here on Mint Press. Now, this is the show where we watch the watchers. As you know, every week we are going against the grain and covering stories which the mainstream media regularly shies away from. And this week we have a very special one for you. Because we are truly independent media with no corporate backing, we do ask you that you support in any way you can, whether that means liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting on this video, and supporting us through Patreon and other places where that can happen. Now, this week, we are here to talk about the prison system that the Israeli occupation enforces on Palestinians. But one aspect of Israeli power has to be understood to be the lobbying of publications around the world to marginalize Palestinian employees. And this week we have a perfect example of what we are talking about. Salah is a photographer based in Gaza who had since 2018 been working on a freelance basis for the New York Times. Now, he tweeted this week, after years of covering the Gaza Strip as a freelance photojournalist for the New York Times, I was informed via an abrupt phone call from the US outlet that they will no longer work with me in the future. As I understood later, the decision was made based on a report prepared by a Dutch editor who obtained Israeli citizenship 2 years ago from a website called Honest Reporting. And now, since that happened, we have been investigating not only the writer that made this report, but also Honest Reporting. Well, to start with, the writer who made this report, which led to the dismissal of Hussam Salim, goes by the name of Avika von Koningsveld. Now, this gentleman formerly was a member of CIDI, the Dutch Israel lobby group. Now, let's not forget that actually a staff member of CIDI in 2010 won a seat in the Dutch parliament as part of the party led by the racist Geert Wilders. Geert Wilders himself was also funded by the Middle East Forum, led by Greg Roman, himself a former employee of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. But what we also have now that has come out about Avika von Koningsveld, not just his belonging to this Dutch Israel lobby group, but also we have found footage, if Ibrahim is able to pull it up and show us, of him at an event rewarding activists from the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, Gilad Erdan. And here he is awarding this lobbyist who is responsible for the report that got a photographer in Gaza fired from his job. So not only do we have the clear connection to an Israel lobby group, we have him clearly here as part of the digital project which the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs ran. Let's be absolutely clear, and we have something more to say about this. Honest Reporting, which is the website that he works for, the CEO of it until fairly recently was a gentleman by the name of Daniel Pomerantz. Now, Daniel Pomerantz was previously in the Israeli military. In addition to that, the current senior editor of Honest Reporting goes by the name of Gidon Ben-Zivi, and he is also ex-Israeli military. But what we also have here is a video that Ibrahim is about to show. It is the executive director of Honest Reporting explaining clearly the way in which Honest Reporting works with the Israeli government. So if we can play that video, please, Ibrahim.
Today I went to a meeting at the Foreign Ministry where there were organizations that work in the pro-Israel sphere that they hosted that are non-governmental organizations. And there were 60 of us there in the room. And the government was explaining what it's doing and how they want to work better with us, it was quite impressive. We've got WhatsApp groups now that are run by the government where we share information, working together. Today I went to
We can continue that video, but I know we just finished it. Sorry. So yeah, so there you have very clearly a situation where honest reporting has a very clear relationship with the Israeli government, and honest reporting actually lobbied New York Times into firing this journalist based in Gaza. So it's very important that we understand that it's not just an individual independent organization that's done this, it's essentially the Israeli government. And this is quite complicated forms and methods of blacklisting they are able to recount the world. When we go from the macro to the micro and look in deeper into Palestine, is really a microcosm of a lot of this that gets exported out and practiced elsewhere in the world. We know that currently the Israeli regime holds between around 4,500 Palestinians in prison. Around 160 of them are children, 32 of them are women, and there is around 800 Palestinians kept in administrative detention without charge or trial. They include 2 women, 6 children, and even 3 members of the Palestinian Legislative Council. Now, throughout 2021, you saw around 8,000 Palestinians arrested by Israel, around 1,300 children, and 184 women. But what we see in the prison system is actually essentially a system of value creation whereby the prisoners generate profits not only for the Israeli government, but also for Western companies. But one of the ways in which value is created for the Israeli government is through debt creation. So Palestinian prisoners can be fined for missing the morning count. They can be fined for returning their food plates to the jailers late. They can be fined even to compensate for quote unquote damage to property, which is caused when Israeli prison guards beat them inside the jail. They can even be fined for refusing to be strip searched or for protesting against the conditions within the facility that they are held. And according to the Euromed Human Rights Monitor, in 2016 alone, it was found that overall fines of prisoners added up to an average of 500,000 shekels per inmate. So what we're talking about there is basically a system whereby people are leaving the prison to be still trapped in debt. We also even had in 2017 the example of minors in Israeli prisons being fined around $11,000 in 1 month alone. There's numerous examples of people having to sell their homes in order to pay off Israeli prison fines, like the Alawi family in Nablus. Or for example, you have the oldest Palestinian woman prisoner, Saadiya Faraj Allah, who was days away from dying. She attended an Israeli military court in a wheelchair and was told that she had to pay 15,000 shekels worth of fines. When we look at the other side of profit generation from this situation, we cannot forget very key and well-known Western corporations who benefit massively from the Israeli prison system. So, for example, US corporation Hewlett-Packard has not only provided systems for data storage, for servers, and the security services for the data within the Israeli prison system, they've also signed deals that are worth over $1 million to provide these for other parts of the Israeli state, but also have been involved intimately in building a biometric database of Palestinians for Israeli occupation forces. You also have the popular, well-known Swedish manufacturing company Volvo. This is a company which is intimately tied to the transporting of Palestinian prisoners through its subsidiary, its Israeli subsidiary, Merkavim, which provides the buses that are used. You even have Volvo machinery that has been used in demolitions of Palestinian homes, also by the Israeli military. You also have the example of the very well-known US company Motorola, which has had a key role in expanding this infrastructure of spatial dominance. Not only does it provide the Israeli police with the Astro 25 communication system, which they use to interact with each other, Motorola Solutions also set up a wide area surveillance system known as Motor Eagle for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. The system is essential to the illegal settlement network and apartheid wall infrastructure. Motorola even went as far as making this special encrypted communication infrastructure for Israel by the name of Mountain Rose. And then we are brought to the massive British company G4S. So previously, G1 Secure Solutions, which is a company in the apartheid state, was known as G4S Israel. It had about 7,000 workers there and provided detection systems to the Israeli prison system. What we also know is that G4S provided the CCTV system and the management systems. They provided the maintenance of the CCTV system, actually. So now, while this company provided ankle monitors to Israel to attach to the legs of Palestinians, we know that popular pressure on G4S actually forced the corporation to sell its Israeli subsidiary, and that is a victory of which we should all celebrate. However, we know that today, G4S's 25% ownership of Palestinian Corporation, it still has a role in occupied Palestine. Palestinian actually trains Israeli police officers on a plethora of suppressive measures, from crowd control to interrogation techniques and undercover operations. So that is some of the background to the infrastructure of the prison system, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot more today with two very well qualified guests to fill us in. So firstly, we're joined by Rolo Jamal, who is the head of monitoring and documentation at Al-Haq. Al-Haq is an independent Palestinian human rights organization based in Ramallah. It was established by several Palestinian lawyers in 1979. We are also joined by Milena Ansari, who is the International Advocacy Officer of Addameer Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association. Now, this organization monitors the treatment of Palestinian prisoners who are arrested in the West Bank by the apartheid state and also by the Palestinian Authority, and it provides legal assistance to those prisoners. It's important we also mention that in October 2021, Addameer, along with Al-Haq and 4 other organizations, the Center for Research and Development, the Defense for Children International, the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees, and Union of Agricultural Work Committees, 6 organizations were designated by the Israeli government in a very damaging move. It was condemned by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and even the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. You even saw a report saying that the CIA had seen the evidence that the Israeli government has used to designate these organizations, and has said that this designation was very unfounded, and really there wasn't evidence to support this assertion of the Israeli government. Now, 30 Palestinian prisoners are today entering their 13th day of hunger strike. They've been rejecting their administrative detention. And just yesterday, you saw 900 Palestinian prisoners in the Israeli prison of Ofa return their meals in solidarity with the administrative detainees on hunger strike. So firstly, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for coming. And the first question I would like to direct to Milena, could you tell us, explain exactly what administrative detention is and what it entails, and also give us a background to these hunger strikes, and also tell us why the case of Salah Hammouri is such an important one.
First of all, really thank you. It's an honor and pleasure to be here on this platform with you, Lowkey, and it's a really important time to look at what's happening in Palestine, give it a bit more attention, and try to see how we can support as much as possible. To begin with, about administrative detention, it's basically a procedure where the Israeli occupation detains Palestinians solely on secret evidence that's neither disclosed to the detainees themselves nor their lawyers. Palestinians under administrative detention could be held for an indefinite time without ever receiving any charges against them or any evidence against them for their detention, or ever standing a fair trial. So the way the Israeli occupation uses administrative detention, they rely on political rationales under the scheme of security threats or security reasons. And so this is the basis of their administrative detention. They say that this person, under secret information we have, may in the future pose a security threat, so we need to detain them right away in prison for an indefinite time. Importantly, administrative detention is a colonial practice that was first established during the British Mandate era in Palestine, and then the Israeli occupation use it as an integral tool to establish their settler colonial regime. In many cases where, as you mentioned, Addameer advocates on behalf of prisoners in military courts. In many cases, when the military prosecutor doesn't have efficient evidence or a proper list of charges against a Palestinian, they go back and rely on administrative detention. So it has been a legal loophole where if there's no enough evidence or list of charges, you can still be detained under the scheme of security reasons and security and secret evidence. Basically, the numbers you mentioned in the beginning regarding administrative detention are not usual numbers. Addameer hasn't reported on more than 800 administrative detainees since 2004, since 2001. It was mainly during the Second Intifada and a few years later after the Second Intifada. So these numbers are extremely high. We're talking about 6 children in detention, deprived of their liberty for absolutely no basis. There's no charges, no crime committed. And of course, this is ongoing against human rights defenders, against former prisoners, exactly like the case of Salah Hammouri. Even if you're a former prisoner who was sentenced to 7 years in prison or even 18, you could be rearrested again just because the Israeli occupation has secret evidence that you pose a security threat in the future. We're not talking about something happening now even. So the hunger strike came following the broad escalation of administrative detention orders against former prisoners, ill and elderly prisoners, against students as well. The hunger strike mainly aims to end the policy of administrative detention as a coercive and an arbitrary tool. Because 80% of the 30 administrative detainees on hunger strike are themselves former prisoners. And when we talk about administrative detention, so a bit not legal aspects, if we think about it, if we think about the psychological impact of administrative detention on Palestinians, this could amount to psychological torture, because you hold a person in prison indefinitely without telling them when they will be released or if their detention will be renewed. And Israel intentionally does not tell the detainees about the duration of detention. So there's constant psychological pressure on them. I would mention for this Salah Hammouri, in his current administrative detention. He was arrested in March, beginning of this year, and till now he's under administrative detention. So Salah Hammouri wrote a letter about his administrative detention in Ufar prison and then Hadarim prison, where he said, "Till when will I be a prison number? Till when will Israel treat me as if I'm a product, as if I will always have upon me and I'm abided by the prison services number and not my own life?" He emphasized a lot about the constant instability that detainees under administrative detention face, because they cannot plan anything for their future and they cannot think of building a life for themselves because they're constantly arrested and they don't know when they will be released. So the detainees are refusing food, they're on water. The 28 of them are on salt as well. But sadly, Salah Hammouri and Ghassan Zawahri, who are in solitary confinement alone, do not even have salt. They're only living on water. So that comes extremely dangerous to their health. Maybe the question of why Salah's case is important, I would send it to Rula, probably give priority to the campaign of Justice for Salah to also be able to be covered.
Thank you for that. Please go ahead, Rula.
Yes, well, first, I'd like to second my colleagues' appreciation for you having us here on a Friday night. And I hope that this will be useful for everyone that is listening to us into actually bringing the attention the hunger strikes need right now. Regardless of the numbers, we don't need to wait for a huge number of people to join a hunger strike or to stay on hunger strike forever for us to actually act. So I really hope that this would excite people to get on this. Many things can be done by individuals, believe it or not. So in relation to why the case of Salah Hammouri has been getting and receiving so much attention, we as human rights organizations, both national Palestinian human rights organizations and international ones, have been working on this case, and we united in a coalition to work on this, despite the fact that he is definitely not the first detainee in Israeli prisons, nor the last one. But actually the case is much more complicated because Salah has been a subject of persecution for the past 22 years. I don't think there is any violation that hasn't taken place on Salah. It all started when he was young in school. He was detained, he was shot at, he was detained 6 times, 3 of which are administrative detention, what Melina has explained. He was also at one time in 2001, he was asked he had actually a plea to leave the country for 14 years because he is also French citizen, to leave the country for 15 years or to stay in prison for 7. And he chose to stay in prison for 7. And why did he do that? Because he knew that if he leaves Jerusalem, and he's a Jerusalemite, if he leaves Jerusalem holding a residency permit, he can never come back. So the situation is extremely dangerous because Salah is, in addition to him being now in detention and him being on a hunger strike, he is at imminent threat of being deported from Palestine. The thing that I just said, him choosing to be in prison instead of living in Europe, says a lot about what he actually wants. And actually revoking his permanent residency, which is definitely, it's a series of actions that Israel is now trying to implement in advance in relation to revoking and basically revoking Jerusalemites from their ideas, so that there is a depopulation policy that is happening in Jerusalem, and Salah is now being being used as a new case. So what is happening with Salah is the following. They revoke his residency in October last year. They base it on that he does not swear allegiance to the state of Israel. Remember, he is a resident of Jerusalem. He has a permanent residency. And the occupier cannot ask the people under its occupation to swear allegiance. So that by itself is considered to be a crime against humanity. And also, all of that is based on a secret file. So he is the first case in the history of Palestinians to actually be, let's say, designed and engineered in such a manner to then cement a new policy of actually lowering the threshold of revoking residencies from Palestinians to then, continue with these policies further on. So this is why it is extremely dangerous that if the case of Salah actually goes on, and it is now in the Supreme Court, which again, you probably know about the judicial system of the Israeli occupation. There is no due process. Even their own lawyers say that there is nothing really, they don't really believe in the due diligence system. So if this case manages to go ahead, we are going to be looking at a very quick revocation and depopulation of Jerusalem. This is why we as civil society are screaming, people, be careful, this is extremely dangerous. This has been ongoing since '67, but now they are really lowering the threshold into a very scary reality that they can just revoke the residency of anyone, saying, you didn't swear allegiance to the state, and we have secret evidence. So this is why, again, we're doing this.
So there we have, in plain terms, it really spelled out for us the way in which the case of Salah Hammouri is a test case, which through then the depopulation and ethnic cleansing, essentially, of Palestinians from Al-Quds can be carried out if this is allowed to happen. So I wanted to just ask you, what's the history of hunger strikes as a method of resistance among Palestinians, and how has the Israeli occupation responded to it?
So to look at the history of hunger strikes, they were as early as 1968. But during that time, hunger strikes were used as a legitimate and peaceful way to protest detention conditions, like the use of solitary confinement, the use of torture and ill treatment, as you mentioned, the violent raids inside prison, restriction on family visits, for example, as well. So as early as 1968, the hunger strikes were also demanding basic human rights for political prisoners and detainees. But hunger strikes, individual hunger strikes or collective hunger strikes against the policy of administrative detention, it was at least since the 1990s. And they have resorted through hunger strikes to better maybe understand the Palestinian prisoners movement approach to hunger strikes. It's really important to note that they are a way to define disciplinary domination powers inside prison, where Palestinians decide to use their bodies to change the power dynamics between the prison guards and their bodies, because inside prison they basically don't have any sovereignty or any authority over their own bodies or their own choices. So for administrative detention, you're already detained in an arbitrary way. It is unlawful that you are here. So hunger strikes become again a way to demand basic rights and freedom of Palestinians and justice, basically. They also, why hunger strikes have been historically the way to protest inside prison is a note Rula mentioned just now. It is that Palestinians really have lack of trust of any Israeli judicial body. Basically, all Palestinians in the West Bank are tried before a military court, where the judge is an Israeli military officer wearing Israeli uniform, the Israeli occupation uniform. The prosecutor is also an Israeli military officer wearing their occupation uniform in court. And the law is always Israeli military law. So the system is built not to actually look into evidence or seek true genuine justice or accountability. The system is built to basically maintain Palestinians inside prison. So it's a tool of domination and tool of oppression. And so lack of trust of any judicial body and that they are prosecuted in, and also the hunger strikes have been really important to focus on the repeated ill treatment of Palestinian prisoners and detainees. So this is about more history, but to explain how the Israeli prison services or the Israeli occupation treats hunger strikes, it's very brutal. It just continues. It's leveraged against them, that they are doing hunger strikes. Immediately when a detainee, a Palestinian, announces their hunger strike, they are immediately moved to isolation. They are moved to very tiny, small, and filthy cells, separated from the rest of the Palestinian prisoners and detainees, as a way to punish them. Not only are they isolated, but they are banned from family visits during that time, and lawyer visits to them are extremely restricted. Sadly, the Israeli prison services, as an economic exploitation, what you were mentioning in the beginning, they issue fines for the hunger striking detainees for each day of their hunger strike, which makes it even more arbitrary measures and ill treatment. Of course, there's a deliberate policy of medical neglect. So the hunger striking detainees do not get full monitoring for their health conditions, because as we mentioned, hunger strikes can have a huge toll on the health conditions of prisoners and detainees if they are not monitored the proper way. So there's complete lack of responsibility taken by the Israeli occupation for hunger strikes. To add to that cruelty, for administrative detention specifically, the Israeli military courts don't even, when they see a hunger striking detainee reaching critical health conditions, and their lawyers appeal their administrative detention, you see the courts affirming the detention, the arbitrary detention. So it's a whole system. Each part, whether it is the judicial system or the military forces, they continue the brutality and the domination against the Palestinians in different ways.
Of course, I never forget the words of Avigdor Lieberman. At the time, he was the foreign minister. He's currently the finance minister of the apartheid entity. He said that he was from the Margaret Thatcher school of thought when dealing with hunger strikers. And of course, Margaret Thatcher had 10 dead men, 10 dead men's blood on her hands for the Irish Republican movement were in British prison, including Bobby Sands, who even won a seat as an MP while he was in prison, and Margaret Thatcher let these men die. Moving on to Rula, could you please just give us a background to the organization Al-Haq? Where did it come from? How was it formed? And what function does it carry out in Palestinian society?
I'm sorry.
No.
I've been talking to myself all along. Okay, so as I was saying, Al-Haq is, as you rightly said, has been established in 1979. It is indeed the first human rights organization in the Middle East. It was basically established because of the lack of the existence of any human rights organizations that were documenting the violations that were taking place in Palestine. And unfortunately, as everyone knows, probably those are many. So the situation in the 80s was of course deteriorating, and that's when a group of human rights lawyers came together and said, we need to document these violations, because if you don't document them, we can't hold any perpetrator accountable for that. So this is how it started. It basically started with some few number of really brilliant lawyers. After the establishment, the continuation of the work was that after we documented all these violations, we looked at, okay, so what do we do with all this information? And that's when we thought of, okay, there are a lot of international procedures, channels that we need and we can use. So the information that is being documented by Al-Haq, which by the way does come up to the level of legal documentation, which is different than media documentation, for example, and it is admissible, so it can be taken into courts. It is international courts for the most of it. We don't work with Israeli courts for the reasons that Milena and I have been saying. So what we also do with the information is that we use it a lot for advocacy. And advocacy is also a legal advocacy, and there is another part which is related to just raising awareness to people on what is really happening in Palestine and why is that a problem. So why does that fall under a colonial apartheid regime, for example? What does apartheid mean? What is a colonial project? How does it look like? And there are many departments at the organization that uses the information that we document in the department that I'm heading into then analyzing it to either go to litigation, so international courts, or go to special procedures with the UN and different other entities within international forums. Or it can also go to sessions like this. So basically speaking to the people, doing events, visualizing the information that is happening. You probably saw the forensic architecture investigation that we did on Shireen Abu Akleh. This is a new thing that we entered into our work of documenting, where Al-Haq, together with forensic architecture in London, we created a unit at Al-Haq that recreates the crime scene. So I think people are now, we're living in a world where visuals are very, very important, and having, exactly. So having these, the facts that we're talking about that are most likely seen as very rigid information, we are also adapting into trying to make that very clear and feasible to people to understand how things have been done. So I do recommend that people watch our analysis into what we did, how did we analyze the spatial and the sound analysis on the spot using different methodologies to make sure how was Shireen Abu Akleh killed basically on that day. So this is the kind of work that we do, and this would lead us very nicely into guessing why we were designated as outlawed and as terrorist organizations, and everything we do and every one of us being part of either we're being part of an act of terror or being part of a criminalized action. So I maybe if you want, I can speak more about the designation itself and what.
I think it would be great if we just got from Milena a breakdown of what Addameer does, also just before we get into the designation. I also recommend that everybody watching this check out the brilliant work of forensic architecture and Al-Haq on the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. This is really special work that has been carried out here, and very, very important for us all to know about and see. So Milena, if you just be able to break down for us what is Addameer and some of its history, and what function does it carry out in civil society?
Well, yeah, definitely. I've been talking about Addameer's work for a long time, but now hearing Rula speak about Al-Haq's work, now I feel like Addameer is literally the baby of Al-Haq in a way. Addameer does similar work to Al-Haq. However, we are very focused on advocating, as you mentioned in the beginning, on behalf of Palestinian prisoners held in the Israeli occupation prisons and the Palestinian Authority as well. So this is really important to always keep in mind that we do different violations, whether it is from our own government, from our own Palestinian Authority, or whether it is the Israeli settler colonial regime. So Addameer uses advocacy campaigns, documentation and reportings, and legal consultation to advocate on behalf of the prisoners. We provide free legal aid and consultation in Israeli military courts and Israeli civil courts as well. Our lawyers do regular prison visits where they take testimonies from the Palestinians firsthand to ask about their detention conditions, if there are any violations of their rights, basically, and whatnot. And then these information, these testimonies, these court procedures are all used and analyzed into publications that talk about the systematic and widespread violations of Palestinian detainees and prisoners' rights. This mainly includes specifically the use of torture and ill treatment. We recently published a report called Cell 26 on the systematic use of torture. This was during 2019 when we were documenting severe torture cases in Al Maskubiya Interrogation Center in Jerusalem. And sadly, during that time, our offices were also raided by the Israeli occupation, where they stole material about the cases of torture. So it's always important to note that whenever we are exposing the violations, we get harassed and targeting our work increases. Other than the publications, so the advocacy, similar to Al-Haq, we report to the United Nations different procedures. We also advocate on behalf of three prisoners victims before the International Criminal Court for their forcible transfer to detention centers located inside what is now Israel. So different type of work, but also how Addameer is more working closely with the community on ground is we make sure that we empower our own community to know about their rights during arrest, during detention. Because sadly, from the first moment of arrest up until release, brutality and violence is embedded into the practices of the Israeli occupation. And it's important for us to make sure that all Palestinians are aware of their rights, even though the moment they're arrested, none of these rights exist. But it's empowering for them to always ask for a lawyer, for example, during interrogation, to always remain silent because that doesn't still incriminate you. So this is the different aspects, whether locally on ground or if it's on an international level.
Thank you for that. And Rula, if you could just break down for us, what does the war against Palestinian civil society consist of? And obviously, there is an aspect of that which targeted both of your organizations.
Yes, so first, maybe we should start by saying that this war against civil society is not new. We hear the term shrinking space a lot, and shrinking space means that there isn't really enough room for human rights defenders to work in Palestine. Like any other oppressive apartheid regime, the oppressor would definitely be doing everything they can to silence human rights defenders and lawyers and anyone who would actually speak the truth, including journalists, as we saw with Shireen and others, of course. So this has been ongoing for let's say more than 15 years, where many different ways of intimidation have been taking place against Al-Haq and other civil society organizations. Some other civil society organizations were closed down, that were smaller maybe in numbers, and unfortunately couldn't take the pressure that was practiced against them. And but basically what made things worse is when we, as Melina was saying and I was saying earlier, we do communicate with the International Criminal Court. Now, since the ratification of the status of the International Criminal Court, the harassment against the civil society has intensified. So it became just larger, and the reason is probably because the perpetrator, which is the Israeli occupation regime, was really scared that we are going to be able to expose and put forward the actions that have been taking place into a legal framework that can lead to a certain result that they don't like, basically. So since last year, and what happened last year is that the investigation was indeed opened by the International Criminal Court, by the prosecutor, and that is when a huge attack on civil society began, until we reached a level in October, as you said at the beginning. They actually took a decision to execute the civil society, and there is no shrinking space anymore. They decided to take a political decision to designate those organizations so that they would give them, so that we are criminalized in everything we do, and then basically aim and hope to shut us down. So in October, we were designated outlawed under the military orders, and also under the Anti-Terror Act of 2016, the Israeli Anti-Terror Act. And what does that mean? So basically that means that everything we do is considered to be an act of terror. Everything we do is a criminalized act. So me now today talking to you, talking to the people listening to us tonight, is considered to be a criminalized action. And this is and what they want to do is that they after the designation, they, as you also mentioned at the beginning of this episode or this session today, is that they went out with an evidence, a file, and showed it to different states, saying that we have connections with the PFLP, and they actually even changed in the wordings after a month or about after 3 weeks, saying that we are an inseparable part of the party. So as you also said, this was not considered by any state. Most of the biggest donors of the organizations are the European states. So what the Israeli occupation is basically saying is that Europe is, building up terrorism in Palestine. After that, in August this year, we were raided by the Israeli military, and they closed down our offices. So this is one of the steps that we were already anticipating. Of course, it is terrible. It is absurd that we are on a level where even human rights defenders are extremely targeted in such a vicious way to try to kind of paralyze our work and to try to paralyze our ability to focus on what actually matters. Another action of that actually also worries us a lot is that Salah Hammouri, our colleague, he is an employee of Addameer, and he was detained administratively because of his work as a human rights defender. Another action that was also used, so they're basically attacking the organizations, but they're also attacking the human rights defenders that are working in those organizations. Salah, for example, he has been vocal for very, very long. Even when he is not in prison, unfortunately, we have to say that when he is not in prison, he's out there promoting, he's out there talking about the situation of prisoners, and they keep on punishing him. And one of the main punishments, also again under the umbrella of the attacking of the civil society, is that they separated his family from him. So his wife, who is French, along with his children, have been separated since 2016. She was denied entry into Palestine, and since then she was not able to enter the country. Today we do think, and well, the way we understand the colonial occupation is that they will probably raid our offices again, because their brutality does not stop, basically. And that is, we don't know if they have also used threats to Shawan, for example, our director, to others as well, through calling their children also, telling them, if your parents do not come to a summoning interrogation, we will come and get you. So we're talking about filthy, low, gang style interrogation and intimidation against our colleagues. So this is the kind of war that we are today facing, unfortunately.
So would you be able to tell us about some of the other organizations which have been designated along with yourselves?
You mean what they do, or how they were attacked?
Yeah, how they were attacked and what they do and what their names are.
Yes, so basically the 6 organizations are, well, Addameer and Al-Haq, and then we have Defense for Children International, and they work on the rights of children, specifically detained children, which unfortunately are many in Israeli prisons. We have the Union of Agriculture Work Committees that works with farmers in marginalized areas, and we have the Bisan Center for Research and Development, and this is a center that does research under occupation. So basically, how do we implement developmental studies under occupation? And then the last organization is the New Union of Palestinian Women Committees, and of course, as its name, they work on also marginalized women and in marginalized areas where services are not provided, on different legal issues, but also social, economical issues. So these are organizations basically covering the entire society with its different sectors and different segments. We have different capacities in terms of how much we can stand in front of, you know, this state that is an apartheid state that uses every single resource to try to shut us down, to try to intimidate us. Some of the other organizations, for example, Bisan, during the raid, they also confiscated every single piece of their offices, together with files, archives, books, desks, everything was confiscated. They entered to the office the second day, and nothing was there. Now, of course, all these offices were sealed with a metal sheet, and we had a paper that said basically that a military order that we're not allowed to work in the premises or do the work that we otherwise do from the offices. So basically not allowing us to work from home on the issues that we do. As well as Defense for Children, a lot of instruments and, you know, laptops, equipments were totally damaged, and a lot of files and archives were confiscated. By the way, all of these organizations has been established since 1980s. So we're talking, and when we say documents and files, we're talking about documentation that is related to Palestinians from the 80s. So this is big, and this is if we lose those, it's a big loss for the entire Palestinian community, not just the Palestinian civil society. Now, allow me just to say that what is worrying us the most is not that we are targeted as, like, per se as organizations. We're worried about the fact that we are today in a reality where civil society is attacked in this manner, and still the reactions to such things are not does not amount to a level where these attacks stop. Because if they do manage to close down some of the most important organizations in the Middle East, this would first allow them to continue the closure of other organizations in the country, basically leaving the entire society without a civil society that actually documents violations. And of course, we document all violations. We document violations by the Palestinian Authority as well, and follow up on these cases. And second, it will be allowing different other oppressive regimes around the world to go ahead and just do the same thing, knowing that nothing would really happen. So this would become a precedent. This would become something that is more and more acceptable. And this is what we're really, really worried about today. Civil society is in danger. And as many people know, a society without a functioning civil society would never be a democratic or safe environment for anyone to live in. So this is where we are today in terms of the threats and how it looks like.
And this is a description of fascism in essence. It would be great to know from both of you what you would recommend for us to do here to support your work, and also to direct us to some links online that we can follow, where we can follow up on your work. That would be to Milena first.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there's many things a person that could do. It's always this question at every panel, and I'm always, to be honest, triggered with this question, because as much as we work on campaigns for Palestinians, there's always that lack of effort regarding how much can we put pressure on our own governments. Because at this point, the EU, even the UK, the US, they all play a major role in sustaining this Israeli settler colonial regime. Palestinians themselves did not bring this occupation and apartheid regime on themselves. It's what you mentioned. It's the continued economic relations between EU states and Israel with their settlement products. It's the continued silencing and impunity that's granted by the international community. So we can share calls to actions, we can share demands and petitions, and we can say, do this, stand up, and whatnot. But at the end of the day, action should be to put actual pressure on your own governments as well, in your own ways. If in your own community, if it's a mayor or a municipality or a bigger village or whatnot, you do have to start small to start big. With how to ask your governments to hold the Israeli occupation accountable. I know most of the audience might be from the UK, and with the Brexit, it's difficult to focus on the EU in general. But really, like, for example, a few days ago, the European Union continued their Association Council meeting with Israel after being suspended for a whole 10 years. And imagine when Palestinians are literally telling the world, we are seeing the gravest violations. Like, our prominent journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, gets murdered, and there's so much evidence on her murder by the Israeli occupation, and then there's no accountability. We are saying settlement expansion is increasing a lot. We need to take action against this. But again, the international community is silent. It's not acting in these regards. So actions that would target the root causes of the problem should come from putting pressure on governments to end ties with a state that on a day-to-day basis violates basic human rights. We're talking about more than 800 administrative detainees held without charge or trial. We're talking about 180 children in prison. We're talking about a case like Ahmad Manasra, who was only a child when he was brutally arrested and subjected to psychological and physical torture. Yet the world stands in silence to defend this child who represent many other children. You have Salah Hammouri, who represents Palestinian Jerusalemites, who are forced to have loyalty to their occupying power that systematically violates their basic human rights. So how are we allowing Israel to continue with this? So petitions, social media storms are always available. You can follow Addameer to check up on the hunger strike of the 30 detainees. What are their demands? You can follow, I'm sure, Rula, you'll be able to, if you want, talk more about the Justice for Salah campaign demands. But what I'm trying to say here is there are many actions that you can take, but if we want to make genuine impact and change the situation on ground here for Palestinians, governments need to move. Governments need to take action and end their impunity and silence to the Israeli occupation violences.
Okay, so that was a lot of things to do. I would say, in complementary to that, is to actually move the people around you. So just let us be aware of who do we elect, because these are the people that are going to take decisions. And so if we can't work with the policymakers that are currently there, and unfortunately I think the UK is in such a position, we should make sure that awareness is there when people do vote. And how to do that is to engage with different segments, to engage with people that are not like us, the people that don't know much about the things that we care most about. We sometimes tend to advocate and lobby among ourselves. I think we need to come out from that comfort zone and start to speak to people who are who receive a totally different information channel that is not allowing them to see what justice is looking like. So I would recommend that whoever from you knows youth groups, students, unions, journalists, engage with those, because this is how we build together a public opinion that would lead to a much better place for the convictions that are related to justice and rights and human rights for all, specifically in the UK, that is very much connected to what is actually happening in Palestine. I would also say that a very concrete example, NSO, as you also mentioned at the beginning of this session today, is an Israeli company that developed the spyware Pegasus. And we as civil society organizations have been attacked by Pegasus alongside Salah. Remember, I said I don't think there's any violation that Salah has not been the victim of. This is, again, another thing. And what we're doing today in Europe, there is a movement against the spyware NSO and anything, the spyware Pegasus, sorry, and anything that is related to it. So when we are more aware of our rights and make steps against those and hold our governments accountable for it, it's when things actually start to move. In the UK, there hasn't been a lot about NSO, despite the fact that there's a lot of information but we haven't really heard from the government on what they think about this. So this could be something in relation to trying to reach a level where such softwares are banned in Europe and in the UK, similarly to what has happened in the US, for example. And I would also say visit Palestine. When you visit Palestine and learn more, and if you have visited Palestine, be ambassadors of Palestine, be ambassadors of justice for Palestine. Don't succumb to people who tell you you're taking sides, etc., etc. This is a rhetoric that we are super tired from. We don't pick sides. What we do is that we speak up for justice, and this is very, very important for us as human rights defenders to continue our work when we know that we are not alone, and that that there are other people around the world that also care, because they feel that there is a shared concern, and that what happens in Palestine from atrocities is also affecting anywhere else. And this is where we also try to care as much as we can and work as much as we can on human rights everywhere, and not only in Palestine. So I invite everyone, even if you don't want to work on Palestine, work on any other issue that is related to human rights, because that would definitely lead into a much better place.
Just leading on from that issue of NSO Pegasus spyware, you know, this is something that is believed to have affected at least 50,000 people across the planet, from journalists to human rights activists to lawyers and others. Now, the key space, I think, which needs to be worked on is the following. In Holland, you have a deal signed between the Dutch government and the Elbit Systems, the largest Israeli arms company, for Elbit Systems to carry out the phone tapping on behalf of the government of the Netherlands. Now, that software has not been installed by the Dutch government yet, despite the contract being signed several years ago. Now, the EU has announced fairly recently an investigation into the Pegasus spyware. Now, I have argued that there is the space to make that argument in the Netherlands, for example, that off the back of the Pegasus scandal, this Elbit software should not be installed and used. And there would be quite wide support if the mechanisms through which we can communicate that message exist within the society. In terms of Britain, a direction you can go, and an unfortunate aspect of this is that Cherie Blair, the wife of the former Prime Minister Tony Blair, is actually on the board of NSO Group. But one thing that I think more work needs to be done on is there's a grouping called the UK Israel Tech Hub. Now, I've been investigating it for a while. It's run out of the British Embassy in Israel. It's staffed by former IDF personnel. It's led by a former Israeli finance minister. And what it works on is obtaining public contracts in Britain to private Israeli companies, a lot of them around cybersecurity. It's worked for an Elbit subsidiary that works in cybersecurity to get contracts within Britain, including within the National Health Service. This UK Israel Tech Hub, which is 100% funded by the British taxpayer, is working for Israeli corporate interests. And also, I think there's an argument to be made for surveillance interests of the Israeli apartheid entity within Britain. So I think it's important that we use this realization that exists on some level off the back of the Pegasus scandal to generalize it out, rather than exceptionalizing it and making it about this supposedly private company, which has since been revealed to work largely hand in glove with the Israeli government, to generalize it out and to work on a wider kind of push around that. But unfortunately, we are out of time. I really hope that we will be able to host you both again for a conversation and an update on how things are going. And I call on all of the audience to please keep in touch with all of the organizations that we've mentioned here. Follow their pages, follow their updates, and please do what you can to support what they do. Thank you very much for joining us on this episode of The Watchdog.
Thank you.